Okay, it is by my watch approximately 10 o'clock. Hi, everybody.
Yes.
This is the Keeping Connected series. It's February 20 or the 15th day of Adar 1. So we are in a perfect place to Marbin Bsimhah. This is David Markus. I am new to the AJR faculty. I am teaching rabbinics, a trimester course right now entitled Joy and Play. And so Aura and company have given me the great honor of being able to share a little taste of what the course is like. Does everybody have the handout for today?
Yes.
Great. And if we are not a large group, oh, hold on 1 second, please. Sorry about that. I am actually at work. Okay, so with a small group, no need to mute. Let's just dive right in. I've been walking around Jewish life for some years now, and I've seen all of these aphorisms and euphemisms for joyful Judaism, which made me wonder, compared to what? Is there something about Judaism that is not joyful, or what is it that we're responding to? If it were not Adar, I might take this hour in a different direction. But it is Adar. And so I thought we would begin to ask the what is joy question and how does it resonate in Jewish life by looking at the text and the tradition from which we derive the tradition to increase joy as we come into Adar. Hello. We're
Hi,
jumping.
Sienna.
Hello, we're jumping right in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So we're going to jump right into the source sheet. I've just introduced myself. I'm Rabbi David Markus. I'm on the AJR faculty. I have a synagogue here in New York called Temple Bethel of City Island, and by day I preside in the New York State court system. So let's get into it. Of all the places in Talmud where we might find a teaching about why and how and even whether we should raise up joy as we come into Purim, I confess to you that I was deeply moved to find it in, of all places, Masechet Ta'anit. The Ta'anit, which is about, of course, fasts, among other things, should bring us this teaching. The Mishnah says, Misha nichnas av ma'atin b'simcha, that when we enter into the month of Av, we should diminish joy. And we all understand why that would be. Av is coming into Tisha B'Av. And this is going to become where we extract our teaching about joy. So just take that in for a second before we read anything else. What might we intuit about the idea that we should extract learnings about joy from Masechet Ta'anit and about the diminishment of joy in the month of Av? Just make up a true story. This is radical stuff, right?
So I'll jump in. Hang on. Yep. Okay, I'm not muted. It's interesting how in the Mishnah and the Gemara, there are a lot of dichotomies in the different Masechtot that we learn about things having to do with marriage in Gittin and divorce in Kiddushin, and it's where the rabbis' minds went. The other thing is this, I'm not sure if the word is dialectic, but the idea with wisdom literature that you've got these contradictions. And it makes sense to bring in contradictions and to bring in the opposite example when you're talking about something, because the natural question is, okay, if we enter Av, we diminish joy. Are we just going to keep diminishing joy? Or is there going to be something that is going to, something where we're actually going to have joy?
That there's something calendrical about something seesaw about our Jewish calendar, that if we're going to diminish joy here, we should lift up joy here. And the proposition too, that joy can be turned up and down at all, like a thermostat. You know, if you're too hot, if you're too cold, you can do something about it. That joy isn't just something in which we are passive observers, that we can actually do, that we are invited, even commanded, to do this thing. So let's get into what this thing is and how we extract it. I'll read in the English that Rav Yehuda, son of Shmuel bar She'alat, said in Rav's name. So when we enter Av, we diminish joy. So too that when we enter Adar, we increase joy. That joy can be calibrated, and that we should learn this from the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, who is this Shmuel bar Shelat guy? What do we learn from him? We don't know a huge amount about him, but Gemara offers a couple of things. First, that he probably was an elementary school teacher, or the Babylonian version of an elementary school teacher. So there's something pedagogical, there's something youthful about this call to joy that he probably passed on to his son. But here's another thing, and this comes from, Susan mentioned Gittin. Turns out it's from Gittin. It's said that Shmuel bar Shelat studied in Bnei Brak. And it's said that all the descendants of Bnei Brak are descendants of Haman. And therefore, by the transitive property of rabbinic math, Shmuel bar Shelat is a direct descendant of Haman. So
And Amalek.
Right, so take that in. Here's the direct descendant of Haman teaching us to increase joy when we enter into Adar. And this is the full moon of Adar today. That is huge. Now, Rashi explains this. Mishenichnas Adar, Yemenisim hayu Yisrael Purim v'Pesach. Okay, when we enter Adar, why do we do this? Because these are days of miracle for Israel, Purim and Passover. Hold on, wait a minute. Adar is not Passover. But it predicts Passover. It's the end of the year coming into the beginning of the year if the month of Nisan is the first. So already, what are we beginning to intuit about Simcha? That it's associational, that we connect it with different times of year. It's commemorative of what has been. The last time we had fun on Purim, the last time we had fun on Pesach, the antidote to what we experienced at the Beit HaMikdash as a people. It's an identification. It's a tikkun for some of what came before. It might even be generational. Here we are teaching kids. But why? Hello, Sonny. It's Ranter Sonny. But why? And this brings us to...
Take advantage of this opportunity of having a snow day.
There you go. There you go. You know, when it snows in Washington, Marbim Bsimhah. Right?
Absolutely.
The proof text from Ta'anit 29b for this is itself radical. Latet lachem acharit v'tikva, to give you a future and hope, from Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah 29 comes to us after the exile in 586, before the Common Era, before the return under Darius and Ezra. This is one of the most famous prophetic texts about what it is to be in Galut, or to be, as Art Green calls it, among the Tfutzot, the scattered, rather than the pejorative exile. Thus says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh of hosts, God of Israel, to all who were carried away, whom I caused to be carried away. Build your houses, dwell in them, plant your gardens, eat their fruit, take families, that you may be increased there and not diminished. So there's that diminishment, joy as a protection against being diminished. Now, this is very different from Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Seek the peace of the city where I caused you to be taken captive. Pray to God for it, for in its peace you will have peace. After 70 years, I'm going to remember, I'm going to take you back. I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. These thoughts of peace and not of ra'ah, latet lachem aharit b'tikva, to give you a future and give you hope. If joy is associational, if joy has a time in the calendar, if joy can be turned up and down like a thermostat, as we're starting to understand from this text, what do we think of this proof text as a basis for that? What's it like to be in exile, diminished, unrooted? And here Jeremiah is, I'm giving you this, says God, to give you a future and hope. And this becomes Gemara's proof text for why we increase joy in the month of Adar.
This is a biblical way of saying bloom where you're planted.
Bloom where you're planted. Thank you. What else? This is radical stuff. We're not passive actors. What else comes?
Well, we make our own joy. We make our own. We make our beds, and we can't just sit around and lament our misfortune. I mean, I'm always reminded of Fiddler on the Roof in the song To Life L'Chaim. You know, God would like us to be joyful even when our hearts lie panting on the floor. We are in exile, so to speak, and we have to make lives for ourselves wherever we are.
Mm-hmm. Nice teaching about positive psychology that maps to the Na'aseh v'nishma. You know, we in Western culture always imagine that we are who we are because we feel how we feel, and therefore the internal circumstances should drive our response to external stimuli. Actually, the teachings of positive psychology go the other way. Na'aseh v'nishma, fake it till you make it. Act happy, and guess what? You actually will be. Of course, it's a danger to that, and we'll get there very shortly. In this text, yeah. Have a future, have hope, plant your stuff, bloom where you're planted, and if you act it out, maybe you'll be that way. And in this respect, joy also is slightly eschatological, right? It's a predictive joy. It's joy that fulfills a promise of redemption.
Mm-hmm.
It's redemptive joy. It's joy with a futurity to it, which is very different from the Bsimhah that we tend to associate with Simcha. Ivdu et Hashem b'yeh.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a time bending going on here. So this proof text brings back into Ta'anit the sense that we are in exile, and yet we're not. That we have reason to be sad, and yet we don't. That Simcha is about now, and also about God's promise of later. That we celebrate now will be fulfilled later. So there's a time bending that goes with it. So Mishenichnas Adar Magbin B'Simcha. We do all of that, and we start to bend time. When is it now? Is it Purim? Is it Passover? Is it the end of the year? Is it the beginning of the year? It's all a little bit mushed, and that's without a leap year. We happen to be in this Purim Katan day right now. Sort of the Vorspice of Purim. Purim without Purim. So it's a perfect day to imagine this time bending. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, sorry for joining late, and you might have said this already, but what I'm also seeing, including with the, the future, the hope, and that there is this a purpose to it. I'm thinking of the, and I'm not sure from which tradition it is, but when you really step in to your fear or your sorrow or that, there's an expansion of a greater reality. So I'm seeing this also, that, you know, I placed you here. I caused you to be captive. And in that, to really look into that captivity. And I think that our ancestors did that. Look what they built when they were captives, the great scholarship that came from there.
The very
So,
fact that
anyway.
we're learning this today, Yafeh, that's exactly right. So we can call that lemonade theology, right? We don't know whether God made the lemons or whether we tripped on them, but we
Lemonade.
got the lemons.
Lemonade.
Let's make lemonade. Exactly. Exactly. So this is just the Vorspeise of the academic theology around Simcha. Let's look at a few very familiar texts and see how well this grounding imports into it. Deuteronomy 16. V'samachta b'chagecha v'hayita ach sameach. Why? Everyone, no matter who you are, you're an orphan, you're a widow, you're a widower, doesn't matter. You will feast. You will be totally simcha. Not just simcha, but ach sameach in your festivals. And my congregants ask me, how can you command that? And then they go, ve'ahavta et. Oh, how can you command that? Is this a command? Is it a mitzvah in that sense? Is it a calling? Is it an invitation? Is it a connection from tzavta, the Aramaic? What is it? Do we bend time? Do we fake it till we make it in our simcha? I'm miserable, but I'm going to sit in my sukkah anyway and naturally be happy. You know, these are questions that come about. What is this simcha? And for all of us who serve, what is it to say, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha bo lefanav birnana, from Psalm 100? Serve God b'simcha. Asterisk. And what if you're not feeling it? Hold those questions, because
Okay.
simcha, right? Because I mean, now we're starting to open up all that pastoral stuff. We need one more concept, that Jewish joy is a little bit like Eskimo snow. There are many words for it. We see osher as another of those words. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha od yahalelu chasela ashrei ha'am shekacha lo. Osher is a little different. And I confess that as a scholar of liturgy, when I look in English translations of Sidurim and I see the word gladden as the translation, my heart just goes, oh, this is joy, y'all. This is not make us merely content. So what's going on here? Let's ask a question. Where does Osher come from? If Simcha has this peak experience idea, fake it till you make it, this imminence of joy, of emotional expression, of expansiveness, I think, as Tsura was saying, how about Osher? Where does Osher come from? Biblically speaking, Genesis 30. And the story's a little bit funny. This is the baby marathon, right? Or I should say the baby sprint. How many of Jacob's wives / maids can have children, and how quickly can they? And so Zilpah, Leah's maid, bears Jacob a second son. They're all, at least in the plot, tacitly or even not so tacitly, in competition with each other to have as many children as possible. And Leah says, Ki ashruni banot. I am in Osher within me. Ki ishruni banot. For the women, the daughters, will happify me. They will call me happy. Batikra et shemo Asher. The academic theology around Osher begins with the premise of calling us into desire, to want something, which is very different from the peak experience of just being in the moment. The theologians who struggle so mightily to find some coherent theology around all of this, and there's many books, and all of them are frankly quite bad about whether there is a coherent theology around this. They tend to divide Simcha and Osher, not perfectly, but somewhat. That Simcha is about now, and Osher is about trying to get somewhere. Not spiritually, but sort of the Aristotelian good life. It starts maybe with a little bit of jealousy. I'm seeing Sonny's hand. I'll stop there and take a question.
Well, it's a question, but more of a comment, because about this nature of Osher. There's a teaching in the Zohar, and you probably know it, about when Moshe and Hashem encounter each other at the bush, and he asks, "What do I call you?" And of course, we all say Ayeh Asher Ayeh, but it can be read Ayeh Osher Ayeh, which is an immutable, eternal happiness that springs from a desire to be in connection with something other than oneself. And I think that really broadens where you're going with this, or where I think you're going with it. And that's an important ancillary teaching.
I think it's not ancillary. I think it's spot on, and it challenges a little bit the intention to divide Simcha and Osher between different planes of existence, because Simcha tends to have this vertical component of wow, of liquefying the self, of transcending self. Osher, at least according to most of the academic theologians, at least in its initiatory stages in Tanakh, has a very different feel. It's not a peak experience. It's a plateau. It's a gentle incline. It's going to the gym when we don't feel like it. That's Osher. Because, if we run our 3 miles or we do our yoga, whether or not we feel like it, over time, we'll get there. It's the self-improvement. It's what the academicians will call not hedonia, like hedonism, but eudaimonia, to use the Greek, that we will improve our lives. The psalmist was very osherdik. Happy is the one who follows the mitzvot. Happy is the one who gives to the poor. Happy is the one who drinks in moderation. Happy is the one who. Simcha Kohelet. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And that's not a fatalism. It's the radical now. And we could spend a whole semester on unpacking the extent to which this is actually, quote, true canonically and true pastorally. Sonny's offer is to bring a little bit of Simcha into Osher, and I very much appreciate it, because these academic categories, do you really think the Eskimos are really precise about their snow? They're poles, they're polarities, they're different shades, and we could add many more. Gila. Rina ditza bechedva ahava achava shalom bereut. They're all flavors of this. And liturgically, we could imagine the wedding as the peak experience of liturgical joy. There's weekday, there's Shabbat, there's the Chagim. And if we look at the liturgy, we could actually see those words popping out more and more depending on where we are in the liturgical cycle. So think about it. Next time you lead, Sarah, is that a question?
Well, it's actually as a participant, and it has to do around Purim. Every year around Purim, I get kind of down. It was a tragedy in my family happened at that time. And I always have to force myself to participate in Purim. And it feels very much like this.
Yeah.
I don't even have, it's not even my desire to feel that joy, but I have the sense of being. And I think this is the brilliance of the holiday, that wherever we are in our life, our personal lives, we can surround ourselves with the community of the joy that coming from them. It does connect with us. It does seep into ourselves, and such brilliance.
Very
So
much so.
I just wanted to
Very
add
much
that.
so. And I suspect that if and when we get to it, the Reb Nachman teaching about this is really going to resonate for you and maybe also trouble you a little bit, because there's a shadow side to this. You know, happy, happy, joy, joy, but there's someone suffering in the corner. If someone's phone is ringing, I'm going to ask that we please mute. Thank you. So next time you're leading, look at the liturgy right before Michamocha. Mariv does not have the word simcha in it really, except L'cha anu shira b'simcha rabba ve'amru chulam michamocha. You would imagine that Tanakh would have the word simcha somewhere in Exodus 15. This is the peak moment, right? This is the simcha that we just studied. It's redemptive, it's futurative, it's immediately now, it liquefies the self. We were all Nevi'im at that moment. And yet, the simcha isn't there. The word isn't there. It's almost as if the liturgists did a tikkun on the Torah by putting that word right before Michamocha to cue us to have that experience when we come into Michamocha. And yet most liberal congregations, my own included, just forgets that word. We start with Michamocha. This is not an Osher Michamocha. This is now. We are liberated now. We are Nevi'im now. Or Shabbat. Boi v'shalom ateret ba'ala, gam b'simcha u'v'tzala.
So,
This is simcha of now, the radical now of Kabbalat Shabbat, the radical now of transcending self. Whether you're in exile, Jeremiah, whether this is a tikkun for the destruction of the temple, Ta'anit 29a, get off out of your dust. This is it. Compared to Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, sitting there, being there is the long-term path to the happy life. Or in the beginning of a service, Ashreinu, ma tov chelkeinu, ma na'im go'aleinu, ma yafeh rushatenu. That all of this stuff are tools for the good life. It doesn't say, samcheinu, ma tov chelkeinu. As Sarah says, sometimes we don't want to go to the gym. Now here's the pastoral question that we all wrestle with. And we're trying to squeeze a semester course into 1 hour here, so please contact me afterwards if there are comments or questions, or type them on the side. I would delight to engage. I would be Bsimhah to engage on this. As we, in our pastoral roles, and we in our own journeying, come on to times and people and practices that seem not to map to the emotional authenticity of the moment. As Sarah says, what do? Do we fake it till we make it? So I want to offer 2 texts on that. One of them is the classical text by Dr. Robert Masters, who is a psychologist of religion, who wrote a wonderful book about spiritual bypassing entitled Spiritual Bypassing. Would someone like to read? And then let's unpack this together. Go for it, sir. Just please unmute. Right, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to try to unmute you. No, you're going to unmute you.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Spiritual bypassing is the use of spiritual practices and beliefs to avoid dealing with our painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. It is much more common than we think, and in fact is so pervasive as to go largely unnoticed, except in the most obvious extremes. True spirituality is not a high, not a rush, and not an altered state. Our times call for something far more real, grounded, and responsible, something radically alive and naturally integral, something that shakes us to our very core until we stop treating spiritual deepening as something to dabble in here and there. Authentic spirituality is not some little flicker or buzz of knowingness, not a psychedelic blast through or a mellow hanging out on some exalted plane of consciousness. Wow, not a bubble of immunity, but a vast fire of liberation, an exquisitely fitting crucible and sanctuary, providing both heat and light for the healing and awakening we need. But if we really want the light, we cannot afford to flee the heat. As Viktor Frankl said, what gives light must endure burning. Wow. Wow.
Deep stuff. Sonny, if you're speaking, you're muted. Masters makes the point that spiritual bypassing is not something that only some people do sometimes. It's what all of us do sometimes. It's almost inevitable that the comfort, allure, commandedness, role, peer pressure, love, purpose, whatever it is that brings us into a spiritual path and into our spiritual service, inevitably will be like the tar that gets us stuck in that very thing. And that's not inherently bad. The problem is when we stay blind to it, when we hold on to a particular spiritual form, practice, or theology in a way that insulates us from a spiritual journey rather than supporting us in taking a spiritual journey. Now, Robert Masters talks about all sorts of forms of spiritual bypassing. To my great humor, there is no chapter on the spiritual bypassing risk of joy. But we all know that it exists. How many people will be like, you know, don't squelch my squee. I'm in my happy place. Or I'm just gonna go dance and whatever. Meanwhile, I hate my mother. And I'm not gonna deal with that relationship. Or, we all have it. So as with all spiritual paths and tools of the spiritual path, the journey of joy has a shadow. I might say this in class. We're learning all this great stuff about joy. When are you not going to use it? You walk into the Shiva and you're going to start telling jokes. Why? Because you're uncomfortable. That's why our tradition is you go into the house of mourning and you sit with someone and you say it first. At most, right. And that the impulse to tell the jokes are great. Jokes have a purpose. They promote resilience. We're going to teach multiple sessions in seminary about the role of Jewish humor. But if the purpose of the humor is not to open the tight place, but to cover up the tight place, the class clown who can't deal with his or her own unpopularity, the person who would rather tell the joke than sit in the discomfort, If it's an end run around the discomfort, that's spiritual bypassing. And that's almost a simplistic form of it. So for today's purposes, I want to recommend the book. And I want to suggest to us that we keep in the back of our mind and on our hearts the proposition that this Adar journey of Marbining Bsimhah has to be for a spiritual purpose, not to cover up discomfort, not to cover up the exile, but to actually change the exile. If it doesn't transform the thing, then it's just a distraction. And that is a deep, deep question. And that's where Reb Nachman goes. And I'd like to spend the rest of our time today unpacking what Reb Nachman teaches about this, and then getting real together about whether he's right, how he's right, if he's wrong, how do we adapt it to our own lives? Have we all confronted or learned at least a little bit about Reb Nachman, the Jewish patron saint of depression? If he were alive today, he'd probably be, he'd be in therapy, he'd be highly medicated, he might be hospitalized. This was not a happy guy. And yet, he's also become our patron saint of joy. And this famous teaching about making the depression dance, Zora, I suspect that you will really resonate with this. We can do the English, we can do the Hebrew. Would someone like to begin taking us through? This is from Likutei Moharan.
I'll start off, but I'm going to, for the interest of time, I will do the English.
Sure.
But if there's something that you need to jump in with the Hebrew, we can do that too.
Sure.
On the subject of joy, by way of parable, sometimes when people are joyful and dancing, they snatch a person from the outside who is sad and depressed. And
depressed in Hebrew, I'm going to stop you right there. Depressed in Reb Nachman's Hebrew does not exist. He doesn't have a word for it. He can only call it black bitterness. Marashchara. I'm going.
Pretty good, accurate.
Yeah.
And bring him against his will into the circle of dancers, so he will rejoice with them. So too with joy. For when one is joyful, depression and suffering are cast to the side. Better still to pursue depression, to bring it into joy. So depression inverts into joy.
Let's stop there. See that? It's easy to say, it may be very hard to do, but at least he's saying that it's possible to distract. It's more fun to dance than cry. But better to bring the depression, to pursue the depression, and bring it into joy, and thereby transform it into joy. One of the texts we're not studying here posits that Marashchora, the black bitterness, does not want to become a Merkava, a chariot for Kedusha, for holiness. That by its nature, he's got a very binaristic way of looking at the world. But depression, atzvut, is sort of like a broken down wagon. It can't lift joy. It can't lift holiness. Even more, such gears as work run the other way. That's his definition of the Sitra Achra. So that's the backstory for why it's important to bring depression into joy. In a sense, it too is eschatological, that if we all can bring the broken down merkavot of life into simcha and help everything become a merkava for holiness, that's what redemption is. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh, b'simcha rabba v'amru chulam. Thank you, Susan. Please keep going.
Thus one snatches depression and brings it into joy against its will. It is a great mitzvah to be joyful always, to overcome and distance from sadness and depression with all one's might. So one must overcome greatly with all one's powers, to be all joyful always.
Stop. What?
Yeah.
Wait. We just read this thing about, that which would give light must endure burning. Whoa.
He didn't read
Let-
the book. Nachman did not read Viktor Frankl.
So before we keep going here, what's churning inside us now?
I don't know about churning inside us, but certainly I'm drawn to context. Maybe that's just the more Machmir part of my head. Knowing fully that Nachman was a manic depressive himself and suffering also with real health challenges.
Yep.
So for him to live and dwell in his pain, you know, what was basically, he found out quickly or somewhere along the way, was a non-starter, and he had to come up with an antidote. And he's speaking of his antidote, especially as you read further along in the passage where he says, take an hour a day, go into the depths of what's really bugging you, but the rest of the time, don't drag it out, which actually is very healthy advice. You know, don't just sit there and be consumed by your sadness. However, look at Frankl, who's writing post-Shoah,
Mhm.
and so he's now reflective and looking back on something that was and how it's affected him, like a Doppler effect, where it's rippling out for him. So it's a very different place. And I think that's really critical to understanding that what seems like perhaps a different approach also is coming at it from a different place.
Different historical context, different personal experience.
context.
One of them is more internal to one's fabric. One is more external circumstances working on the internal. And Viktor Frankl writes that loving his wife, having the memory of her visage, was his resistance against meaninglessness in the late nights. So maybe
So in a sense, when he says that, he's doing exactly what Reb Nachman is teaching us to do, is bring in something that helps you break your focus on your personal despair, that
Which is-
allows
right.
you to move past, to still be functional, both spiritually and in the Sia as well.
Right. He now
In all worlds.
so I'm watching Sarah's face go.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Go for it.
So, okay. Well, and maybe because I read further, but I'm also thinking of Jeremiah, and I'm thinking of our work in pastoral care, that that shadow is there, that place of a despair is there, and to enter it, to break it open, to make that expansion is also really important. So when he says, you know, to always live in joy is, I mean, that's spiritual avoidance. And so that's really where I'm going. That
Shamati, it's
Yeah.
spiritual avoidance, or
Yeah.
in master's language, it's spiritual bypassing.
that's what I meant.
Yeah, Mashona.
Yeah.
Unless the thing is actually transformed, not put on a shelf, not avoided, not crusted up so it becomes calcified or brittle, but actually transformed. That's a very subtle thing for ourselves and also for the people we serve, who may see us, you know, we should be lucky if they see us once a week on Shabbos, right? It's not easy to make that distinction.
Hafachta mispedi lemachali, you know,
Mhm.
that God turns our mourning into dancing. Maybe because it's not so easy to do it ourselves. And what I'm thinking about here in reading Reb Nachman, my father died the first day of Chol Hamoed Pesach, 7 years ago. It's hard to believe. And the fact that because he died during Chol Hamoed, we buried him, but Shiva did not start until Pesach was over. And this idea of going about, you know, the community's need to rejoice in the festival overrides the person's need to mourn, but there's still this understanding that, yes, I'm in shul on those days, and I'm and maybe Sukkot is a better example. You're sitting in the sukkah and having your meals, and you'd rather be anywhere else. But there's a way of trying to bring someone in by insisting that they join in the dancing. And with Purim approaching, we have to hear the Megillah. We don't go to the party afterwards, kind of thing. Right. So that's what it seems to me that Reb Nachman perhaps is bringing in here.
And to put an even finer point on it, not a subject that we have time to discuss in our limited hour, but there's a large corpus of halacha and halachic head scratching that asks the following question. If you're not feeling joyful on Pesach, well, tough noogies, fake it till you make it. If you're not feeling joyful on Sukkot, you still have to sit in the sukkah. There's some halacha that says if the sukkah smells, you don't have to go in. If it's raining, you don't have to go in. If you're feeling unwell, you don't have to go in. What if you're sad? What if you're depressed? What do the answers mean in terms of your personal experience of the Chag, for the community, for how we pastor to our people? Is it an outside-in sort of thing? Is it an inside-out sort of thing? What's the function of the Sukkah? If we don't give it our all, will it give us its all? If we force people into it, or if they feel forced into it by any stricture at all, will they feel that the Sukkah loses its juice, loses its magic? This is Hechag, this is the festival. And you want I should sit here suffering? I'm going to ask my students in this course to puzzle it out. Because on this, when the rabbis, collectively scratch their heads around the halacha, we did not understand depression to have a medical component to it. And if it's not medicalized, what if you're just in mourning? Should you do it? Or what if, there's a yard site? Or what if September 11 had actually happened, October blank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Where do our spiritual practices actually take us when the rubber hits this road? And that's the question that Reb Nachman is now going to wrestle with. So please, Susan, continue for us.
All right, so one must overcome greatly with all one's powers to be joyful always. For human nature is to conduct oneself with the depression and sadness arising from the misfortunes and happenings of the times, and all are full of suffering. So one must force oneself with great power to be in joy always, and to make oneself joyful as much as one can, even with silly words. Even one who is broken-hearted will be very good with all this, except for 1 hour. And it is suitable to designate some hour per day to break one's heart and to speak freely to God as it may come to us. But the rest of the day one must be in joy. From a broken heart, one easily can come to depression, for the broken heart is very close to depression. So one always must be in joy, but for a single hour in which one will have a broken heart. Very Monty Python in the language. But I'm thinking about, I don't know if anybody's watching on Netflix, the show Shtisel. There's a scene where all of these rabbis are out in the field doing this hitbodedut. And one of my first classes in rabbinical school was with Rabbi Joe Hammer, where it was raining, so we couldn't go outside to do it, but we were at the College of Mount St. Vincent, and each of us found a space to engage in this hitbodedut, which was very interesting. And I think Reb Nachman is a little ahead of his time in psychotherapy. that we do need to allow ourselves the opportunity to grieve and to be sad. He's not saying that we shouldn't do it. But with worrying, people who worry, if they set aside a specific amount of time to worry, and when the timer goes off, they continue with their day, then hopefully those worries and obsessions won't infiltrate the rest of their lives.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm going to just give a, yeah, me too on that one, because you can't worry something into existence. It's a basic fact. So I'm reminded, if you saw the movie Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks, it's about the swap of Gary Powers for Rudolph Abel. And and Bill Donovan, who's his attorney, asks him repeatedly, well, aren't you worried? And Abel always says, why would it help? In other words, worry doesn't help an outcome. Although I've had one lady who said to me, Rabbi, you always say we shouldn't spend time worrying, but I got to tell you, it works for me. I said, why? She goes, because every time I worry about something, it doesn't happen. Now you hear the paradox, right?
Mhm.
So, the power of magical belief. But I do think the Bruslover is onto something, Frankel notwithstanding. If you have to ask the question at some point, does it help? And if God is also in that space of immutably happy, when we're in depression, then we are also estranged from the divinity. We are not apart, or we are at least further apart from the divine, from the one, because that is not the nature, in my opinion, that is not truly the nature of Hashem's chalik.
And for we who are sort of on the inside of the curtain, who sit with these theological texts and take on spiritual practices and try them on and can move more seamlessly back and forth, the danger of Reb Nachman's words to someone who isn't in that place,
Oh, yeah.
you get it.
Right.
You got it instantly. It's like, oh, God's not in your sadness. Well, either, this is the theodicy question. Either God isn't good, or God isn't all-powerful, or God isn't fair. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why did this happen to, when? And if I can't be sad with God and God isn't with me in my sadness, then what the hell am I doing here? Or what's wrong with me? And so all of that stuff is operating in this tohu vavohu of the internal landscape. Yeah,
May
sir.
I say something about that?
Please.
Yeah. In my personal, but especially in my professional experience, as a chaplain, and usually I work with people who are dying, and or grieving, and that fear of really breaking open the heart causes almost like a stenosis of the heart of being in joy, and till that is broken open and saying yes, this ba 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 ba, and that the really breaking open and knowing that it's safe, that 1 hour or whatever that time is.
We all
safe
do
to
have an
do
hour
that.
a day to do this, right?
Oh,
We all
absolutely.
have that time in our calendar.
Absolutely. A minimum of 15 minutes, no, in private. But that fear of being sad doesn't allow for the pure joy either. That's, I guess, my point.
Right. We know from experience, and we know from the people that we serve, that the human screen against emotions tends to be very poorly selective.
Yes.
That when we start to screen out one emotion, we tend to screen out more than the one emotion we intend to screen. So if you can't feel this, you're not going to be able to feel that either. And it's not just because of some yin-yang thing. It's our very capacity to feel that's being diminished in the nature of what we are trying to do. There's a bit of a self-numbing that happens. So I want to take you in to a very exquisite moment in this Hitbodedut practice. You've spoken to God. And if you've never tried Hitbodedut, there are some suggested how-tos at the bottom of your page, but you'll find your way. You've spoken to God. You felt the heartbreak. You felt the loss, the hurt, the anger, the whatever it is. And then the proverbial buzzer goes off. What is that gear shift like? Is it quick? Is it sticky? Does time feel like it bends in that moment? What Reb Nachman is asking of us, he doesn't quite narrate it here, is to be emotionally and spiritual nimble, that we can move from wherever we are into this state almost with the deft of an ice skater. And that spiritual practice is partly about reducing the friction between these different states so that we can move between them and not get stuck. And as for us, in a sense, so for the people we serve. But everyone knows, says the psalmist, their own bracket. Sadness, heartbreak, joy, service, whatever it is. Everybody has their own. Which brings us to where we started this session. There's Simcha, which is the peak experience. And some people can't be in that peak experience or love that peak experience so much that they can't deal with anything else because I'm here. I'm here and I can't be anywhere else because it's dangerous for me. As pastoral caregivers, as fellow journeyers, as people who lead community, we have another tool in our pocket. We can be with people where they are, but for folks who gravitate towards Simcha, we can offer these Jewish texts on Osher as a way to say it's not just sitting atop the mountain. And for people who don't feel Simcha because it's all about going to the gym, it's all about the mitzvot, we can offer them this text, among other tools, to begin inviting a curiosity about what it would be to start to open up that space. And dafka now, in this Purim Katan, which is the Purim, which isn't Purim, which is Adar, which isn't really Adar, but it's sort of Adar because next month's Adar. And then we get to Nisan, which is really about the liberation and the Simcha. So we're on this 2-month runway. It's literally 2 months from today on the lunar calendar that we're going to have our first Passover Seder.
Don't rush it.
Cherish every minute. So we've covered a lot of ground and opened up a lot of questions just in these 50-something minutes. There's liturgy and Gemara and proof texts and pastoral care and Chassidut and Nevi'im and all of that. I want to invite us to let these texts deepen in our own spiritual practice. If you are not in a Hitbodedut practice, perhaps now is a propitious time in this first Adar, moving into second Adar, to move into this as a tikkun for the text, as a tikkun for the exile, to come into Purim Bsimhah, to invert. And I want to thank you for being with me. We have time for a few questions or maybe a few comments, but I know that the minhag is to end precisely at the 1 hour mark, so I will try.
Yishar Koach, this is an amazing teaching, and I look forward to being able to incorporate it personally and professionally.
Chatiya, Susan, thank you.
Kol hakavod, Chaver.
This is great. Thank you. This has been so helpful. I want more.
Me too. My email is in the materials. I welcome comment and would love to continue learning with all of you.
Siona, you've been quiet. You're
I
muted.
tell you, I am absorbing every word. It's just so fantastic that I think that less is better for me right now because it was like too much to absorb. And I just know that being happy is my goal all the time. And it's always like a mitzvah, like Reb Nachman said. And I will keep that teaching close to my heart. Thank you very much.
Bevakasha. Thank
Right.
you,
להתראות.
everyone. Chag Purim Katan Sameach.
And to you.
Bye-bye.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Shalom.